take the front row for you. Sit in the front row for you.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be back in Israel. This is my second visit since the horrific attacks by Hamas on October 7th. I joined President Biden on his visit on October 18th, and our message then is the same as my message today, which is that the United States stands with Israel. As President Biden has said many times, Israel has a right, indeed a duty, to defend itself against Hamas, a terrorist group that committed the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, that used rape and sexual violence to terrorize Israeli women, that continues to hold hostages, women, the elderly, the sick, the wounded, and hide in tunnels they've purposely built under civilian infrastructure. And I'm here today on President Biden's behalf to emphasize our continued commitment to support Israel in its fight against Hamas. Yesterday and today, I've met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet, President Herzog, and a range of senior officials. We discussed the ongoing war and military operations, and we discussed our shared objective of ensuring that Hamas will never again pose a threat to the state of Israel, while minimizing harm to civilians, while ensuring the increased and sustained flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and while working day in and day out, hour by hour, to secure the release of all of the remaining hostages so that they can return home to their loved ones. We consulted on our joint efforts with the United Nations, with Egypt, and other regional partners to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. We did not do a great job of putting the podium sign on. And I described U.S. efforts in coordination with allies and partners to deter attempts to expand the conflict regionally, including in the Red Sea, and expressed President Biden's commitment to restoring calm along the Blue Line through a combination of deterrence and diplomacy. Later today, in fact, after I leave here, I will visit Ramallah to meet with President Abbas and discuss ongoing efforts to promote stability in the West Bank, including through efforts to confront terrorism, to support the Palestinian Authority security forces through the U.S. Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority, through ongoing efforts to revamp and revitalize the Palestinian Authority, and through initiatives to hold extremist settlers accountable for violence against Palestinians. I have and will continue to state President Biden and the United States' commitment to preserving space for peace, for a two-state solution where Israel's security is guaranteed. The Israeli people need and deserve to live in peace and security with their neighbors in a region that is integrated, dynamic, and stable. That is what we are working toward. That is what I discussed with my counterparts and interlocutors here in Israel, and that is President Biden's fundamental vision for the future of this region. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions, and we'll start with Alex from CNN.
Thanks very much, Jake. The administration has made it clear that you are hoping that this fight will transition at some point from this high-intensity phase to a lower-intensity phase. What are the Israelis telling you in terms of the conditions that are needed for that to happen, and how does that sync up with your preferred timeline? And then, if I may, the administration has insisted that Israel has the intent to keep civilians safe, and we at CNN and others are reporting that almost half of the 30,000 bombs that have been dropped on Gaza have been so-called dumb bombs, imprecise. If there was a real intent to protect civilians, wouldn't they be using much more precise, smaller munitions?
So first, I really appreciate the question on the phases of the conflict, because I think there's been some misunderstanding in the reporting, not from you, but from others. When Israel launched this campaign to root out the terrorist threat that Hamas poses to the state of Israel, it made clear from the beginning that this war would proceed in phases. We are now in the middle of a high-intensity phase with ongoing ground operations, military operations, in both the northern half and the southern half of Gaza. But there will be a transition to another phase of this war, one that is focused in more precise ways on targeting the leadership and on intelligence-driven operations that continues to deal with the ongoing threat that Hamas poses. The conditions and the timing for that was obviously a subject of conversation that I had with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the War Cabinet, with the leadership of the IDF, with the defense minister. And I think it's really important that those conversations take place first in a spirit of partnership. We're not here to tell anybody, you must do X, you must do Y. We're here to say, this is our perspective as your partner, as your friend. This is what we believe is the best way to achieve both your tactical and strategic goals. And then second, it has to take place in private because we can't telegraph for the enemy what the plan is. So I'm not going to speak to timelines, and I'm not going to speak to conditions here from the podium. What I am going to say is that we had a very constructive conversation yesterday about the transition from the high-intensity phase forward, and we expect that that will occur in the future. When exactly that happens and under exactly what conditions will be a continuing intensive discussion between the United States and Israel, and I will make sure that that conversation, at least as far as I can do it, is going to take place behind closed doors. When it comes to the issue of the bombs, the type of bombs that Israel is using, what I would say is that different types of munitions require different types of military operations, meaning the method by which bombs are delivered that don't have the tail kits on them is different. In terms of how the planes fly, in terms of how the targets are selected. And they all go through the same process, a process by which Israel selects targets and tries to distinguish between targets that hit Hamas and those that might take the lives of innocent civilians. At the end of the day, what we have consistently said is that Israel has the intent to make sure that it is drawing those distinctions clearly and in a sustainable way, and we want to see the results match up to that. That's a conversation that I had in full with them today and yesterday as well, and we'll continue to do that, including on the type of munitions they use and when they use a certain type of munitions, how those are delivered to ensure that from the United States' perspective, they are fulfilling their obligations, their responsibilities as a state to international humanitarian law. Yanir from IDF Radio.
Hello, sir. Thank you for doing that. The Defense Minister Gallant told you in your meeting that it will take months to defeat Hamas. And to my understanding, he refers to the high-intensity operation. Netanyahu also says similar things. The question is, what will happen if in a few weeks or even 2 months, Israel will say to the United States, we have not finished the job in this high-intensity way, and we need a few more months, maybe 6 months. What will be the response of the American administration? Will it reduce, for example, the military aid to Israel? And is the Prime Minister's statement that the day after defeating Hamas, military control should remain in Israel's hands, capable to if it's acceptable to the American administration? And just another question, please. You met with the head of the Mossad yesterday, and also yesterday the American official said that there are new ideas regarding to the release of the hostages. Are you more optimistic about the possibility that we will see soon a new plan to release more hostages? Thank you.
I will do my best to answer those multiple questions. You may have to remind me of one or two of them. First, as I said in a TV interview last night, what I heard Minister Gallant to say was that the fight against Hamas is going to take months. And of course, we agree with that. This fight against Hamas, a deeply entrenched terrorist group in Gaza, is going to take time, and it's going to happen in phases. And we've said that from the beginning. And so there's no contradiction between saying the fight is going to take months and also saying that different phases will take place at different times over those months, including the transition from the high-intensity operations to more targeted operations. We had a very good discussion about how that transition will occur and under what conditions and on what timeline. And we will continue that conversation. Secretary Austin will be here soon to continue it in detail. And again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that for the reason that laying out Israel's war plan for the public is only going to help Hamas, and I don't intend to do that. But I did not hear Minister Gallant or Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday to say things that would lead me to feel I need to answer the hypothetical question of if then down the road. We will work together in partnership, in coordination, and we will continue to supply our ideas, our perspective on what makes the most sense for Israel, both strategically and tactically. And I would also add that, from our perspective, distinguishing between innocent Palestinian people on the one hand and Hamas on the other hand is not just a moral question, though it is a moral question because innocent people's lives should be sacred and protected. It's also a strategic question for Israel. And I think my Israeli counterparts didn't just acknowledge that, they very much indicated that their goal is to try to distinguish between innocent Palestinians and Hamas as we go forward. And we will continue to reiterate both publicly and privately our commitment to the notion that every innocent life should be sacred and should be protected. On the question of what happens in Gaza once the military operations are complete, the Israeli government has indicated that it does not have a long-term plan to occupy Gaza, and that ultimately the control of Gaza, the administration of Gaza, and the security of Gaza has to transition to the Palestinians. Now, the question of how that transition occurs, over what timetable, that is also something that we are having intensive discussions about. But the U.S. position on this is clear. We do not believe that it makes sense for Israel or is right for Israel to occupy Gaza, reoccupy Gaza over the long term, and that we would like to see ultimately that transition take place, and we can continue to work through the circumstances and the context for that transition. And then your final question was on the hostages.
You're more optimistic that we're going to see a new plan for that.
Look, here's what I will say. I can't characterize myself as optimistic or pessimistic because, we're talking about not just the people who are being held in captivity, but their family members who are waiting hour by hour, day by day, to learn the fate of their loved ones, to know when they're going to come home, when they'll be able to embrace them again and hold them again. And so I don't want to be in the prediction business with something as heavy as that. What I will say is that my meeting with the director of the Mossad last night, we were supposed to meet for about 45 minutes. We ended up meeting for more than twice that because we had a very detailed and intense conversation about how to move forward to try to secure the release of all of the hostages. Ultimately, that will be something that we have to work in a very sensitive way between the U.S. and Israel, working with Qatar, with Egypt, with other actors. And so I will leave that conversation where it belongs in those sensitive channels. But I will just say this has seized the attention from the very first day of the President of the United States and every other senior member of his team. And just this week, the President met with the families of the American hostages to reaffirm for them that we're going to do everything in our power, working with our Israeli counterparts to ensure that every hostage comes home safely. And I'll leave it at that for today. Thank you. Hallie Jackson, NBC.
Hey, Jake, thank you for doing this. Two questions for you, one looking ahead to your trip and then a separate one on the broader potential for a regional conflict. The Prime Minister has reportedly suggested that the Palestinian Authority wants to destroy Israel in stages, unlike Hamas. A senior administration official for the U.S. said just last night that the Palestinian Authority needs to be revamped and revitalized. So given that, do you believe Abbas is best positioned to lead the Palestinian Authority into whatever happens next in Gaza, into whatever happens next in the region? And then secondly, I know you've had some conversations about what's happening more broadly regionally. Do you have any indication or any concern that the Prime Minister is poised to launch a bigger campaign against Hezbollah in the north?
So taking your second question first, as I have said and others in our government have said, we believe that ultimately the citizens of Israel who have been evacuated from the north have to be able to return to their homes and have to be able to do so with a true sense of security. And that means dealing with the threat that comes from the other side of the border. But we also believe that that threat can be dealt with through diplomacy and does not require the launching of a new war. Now, it requires not just diplomacy, but as I said in my opening, deterrence as well, because we need to send a clear message that we will not tolerate the kinds of threats and terrorist activity that we have seen from Hezbollah and from the territory of Lebanon. But in our view, and I reaffirmed this yesterday, the best way to do this is to come up with a negotiated outcome, in which those Israeli citizens in those communities up on the northern border can know that they are not going to be subject to an attack that would take their lives or destroy their communities. We'll continue to work at that, and I believe that we can accomplish that, and that is going to be a significant priority for the United States. When it comes to the Palestinian Authority, I am not going to characterize personalities. What I'm going to say is, at a basic level, we do believe that the Palestinian Authority needs to be revamped and revitalized, needs to be updated in terms of its method of governance, its representation of the Palestinian people, and that will require a lot of work by everybody who is engaged in the Palestinian Authority, starting with the president, Mahmoud Abbas, who I will go see. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the Palestinian people to work through their representation, and it will be up to those leaders of the Palestinian Authority to work through the types of steps that they need to take to reform and update the authority for the situation we face today. The United States will be a partner in that with them, respectfully, and we will be there to try to support their efforts to ultimately deliver a vision in which Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace and security. Ahmad from Al Arabi.
Hello. What if the intense phase of war continued for months, not for weeks, as you hope? What the United States will do to save the lives of Palestinian children and women?
So I fielded a very similar question from IDF Radio, the what if question down the road. And I said before that I'm not going to entertain those hypotheticals because my job here is not to go out into the future and say, if X, then Y. It's rather to say, here's how the United States sees the situation. Here's the way in which we believe Israel can best ensure that Hamas never represents a threat to Israel again, one, and two, protect the civilians of Gaza and enable them to have a future, a vision of a future where they can live in peace and security as well. That's what we're doing. I'm doing that today. President Biden does that every time he speaks with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And we're not kind of engaging in a hypothetical conversation about what could come. We are laying out what we believe is the best course forward. We're doing that behind closed doors because we think that's the best way to achieve convergence around an approach that satisfies those objectives I just laid out. And, obviously we will see how things unfold and make decisions accordingly. And the president will look at the situation at every point along the way and judge how the United States should react and respond to that. And I'll leave it at that for now rather than try to answer a hypothetical question for the future. Britton from ABC.
Hi, Mr. Sullivan, you mentioned Israel's right to self-defense. Does the right to self-defense justify the level of human suffering we're seeing in Gaza right now?
Look, I think we have to take a step back and put in context what has happened since October 7th. On October 7th, you had a terrorist group, Hamas, come across the border from Gaza into Israel and massacre 1,200 people in a brutal and savage way. They then turned around and went back into Gaza and hid behind a civilian population, using civilians as human shields, using protected sites like hospitals and schools for military purposes, embedding themselves among the innocent Palestinian people and continuing to fire rockets at Israeli cities and continuing to go out on the airwaves and say, we're going to commit October 7th again and again and again. And go out and state, we're in a permanent state of war with Israel, and go out and state, we would like to see Israel's right to exist eliminated. So that is the reality that the IDF is contending with when it goes in. It doesn't have the opportunity to meet Hamas on a field of battle in a way in which civilians are off to one side and the terrorists are off to the other side. The terrorists chose to embed themselves among civilians. And that creates an incredible burden on the IDF, a burden that is unusual for a military in today's day and age. Now, that burden does not lessen the IDF's responsibility to act in a way that distinguishes between terrorist targets and innocent people, and to take every precaution to protect civilians, and minimize the loss of life. It also doesn't lessen the burden, by the way, to ensure that humanitarian assistance flows in sufficient quantities that the Palestinian people have access to the food, water, medicine, sanitation that they don't just need, that they deserve as a basic matter of dignity of human beings. And so those are messages that we have conveyed quite clearly to the Israeli people. But what I think has been lost a little bit in this whole debate is the responsibility that sits with Hamas, who not only is doing all the things I just described to put the Palestinian people in a terrible position, but is also holding more than 100 hostages still to this day, men, women, children, in tunnels, in circumstances that are dire and deteriorating. So our position from the very first day of this conflict has been that Israel has the right to go after Hamas in these difficult circumstances, and also has the responsibility to do so in a way that comports with our values, with international humanitarian law, and with the strategic necessity to see the fundamental difference between innocent Palestinian people and these evil terrorists of Hamas. And that is a position that we have stated publicly. It is a message we drive in very granular terms privately in the conduct of these operations, and we will continue to do so as we go forward. I'll take one last question from Roy.
No, from Channel
Why not?
12.
Oh, Channel
He's not here.
Okay, no problem.
Hi,
Channel 12.
thank you very much. Two questions. Once I would like to follow up about the hostage. Israel, the IDF has recovered 3 bodies only today of people who went hostage in Gaza. Do you think Israeli officials understand the necessity of or the urgency to bring everyone home as soon as possible? And you have mentioned, beside Qatar and Egypt, other players, other mediators. Germany is one of them, because it has been reported earlier today that German intelligence would like to be involved. And I would like to ask you also about the Houthis. There was another incident in the morning, one yesterday. Why we are not seeing any aggressive response by the US against the Houthis, against Iran, when you know it's on a daily basis and you have the firepower in the region?
So first on the Houthis, as I said last night on, I think, your network, the Houthis represent a material threat to freedom of navigation, to commercial shipping, to lawful commerce, and they're doing so in a vital artery there at the Bab el-Mandeb and into the Red Sea. And the United States is working with the international community, with partners from the region and from all over the world to deal with this threat. We are building a coalition. We are working to ensure that and rally the nations of the world, all of whom have an interest in seeing this stop. This is not about the United States and Israel. This is about the entire international community. And we will continue to take every step that we deem necessary and appropriate to deal with the threat that the Houthis pose. And to your question, also deal with the fact that while the Houthis are pulling the trigger, so to speak, they're being handed the gun by Iran. And Iran has a responsibility to take steps themselves to cease these attacks, because these attacks, as I said before, are a fundamental threat to international law and to international peace and security. And we will continue to consult about the best way forward, the best means of response. Secretary Austin will be in the region in just a couple of days, not just here in Israel, but in Manama as well, to continue to work on what the most appropriate response is. That response, in our view, shouldn't just be the United States. It should be a broader coalition of countries working together in concert, and that is what we intend. With respect to the hostages, I can't speak specifically to German intelligence and their role. What I will say is, from our perspective, the more ideas, energy, and efforts that can be pursued, including with good partners like Germany, bring it on. I mean, it would be good to be able to work with them in all of this, but the main effort to date in terms of the first round of hostage releases and the continuing discussions involve Israel, the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and we will look to other partners for their ideas and their thoughts on this as we go forward. And I think you asked another question, but I may have forgotten it. Or maybe that's it.
The necessity, because families here believe it is
Oh, is Israel? Yeah. Yes,
the main priority to bring everyone?
I believe it is a priority of the government to bring everyone home. I heard that in stereo yesterday in my conversations. It is a paramount priority of the United States for our citizens, but also for all of the rest of the hostages. And I found it to be a priority for every member of the government. And then, as I said, something that the director of the Mossad is working intensively at the direction of the government in a way that, frankly, I find admirable, his personal efforts. And we will continue our work on this, and we'll continue to work closely with the Israeli government. Thank you, guys.